Hello, welcome back to my world of stuff. Today, a little question to consider. It's the mighty world. I haven't done anything for a few days. Apologies for that. I'm just enjoying some downtime at the moment. It's been a busy few weeks with one thing and another. I've got nothing much lined up now for a week or so. So I thought, as I've not done a video recently, I would just have a little chat about one of the topics of the day in the world of entertainment. And that topic is, has the Marvel Cinematic Universe peaked? Has it seen its best times? Is it now approaching its end game? Or less pompously, do you think Marvel has gone off the boil? It's a question which a lot of people are asking these days. I'm not the first person to do a YouTube video about this. I'm not the first person to consider whether this is the case. And I think it'll be interesting just to have a chat about, generally, I've not planned anything, not prepared anything, but I've got some rough sort of ideas of myself about Marvel and where it's been and where it's going. The MCU as we know it then, of course, just a bit of background, started back in 2008 with Iron Man, Jon Favreau's Iron Man, the first film in what we now know as the MCU. That was an interesting time because growing up, I used to read a lot of American comics. I used to read DC. I was a big Batman, Superman fan. And I was aware of Marvel's characters, Spider-Man and so on, until even before they first appeared in the 70s in the UK in the mighty world of Marvel comic, which was a bit of a revolution back in October 1972 when Marvel took its first steps into the UK market very successfully, and it spread out into lots of other comics and introduced a lot of other characters. It started off with Spider-Man, the Hulk, Fantastic Four, and then we had Thor, and all the other characters came in. And that, in fact, sort of mirrors what's happened with the MCU. The way that Marvel started tentatively and then blossomed in lots of new titles and lots of comics and lots of different areas. And at one time there was, I don't know, it must have been half a dozen Marvel comics coming out weekly in the UK. And I think perhaps that's a sort of a slight salutary lesson and a warning in that eventually all that imploded. A lot of the comics combined, some were relaunched. I mean, Marvel still has a comic presence in the UK now in the form of these monthly, not digests exactly, they bring out the Marvel Select range, which tends to coincide with the release of a new film where they have a batch of comic strip stories based on characters in a new film. They do a monthly Spider-Man comic, which seems to be doing well. So they still have that sort of presence on British magazine shelves. But it peaked back in, I would say, probably about 76, 77. And then the comics, as I say, they started to sort of fade away a little bit and combine in the way that British comics often did. And as I said, I think that does reflect the way possibly we're going with the MCU in terms of the cinematic universe. I'm not going to do a long history of the MCU because if you're watching this video, you'll probably know it. You'll have seen most of those films. You'll have your favourites. We've had something like 32, 33 films now, up to and including the current Guardians of the Galaxy. And I think Marvel had this massive upward trajectory because these were all characters that I knew these characters. I knew about Iron Man, I knew about Thor, Doctor Strange, because I'd read the comics. And it was great because I never thought that I would see these characters on the screen brought to life in these extraordinary spectacles. So to see Iron Man and then Captain America, then Thor, then the Avengers. I mean, seeing the Avengers Assemble film, as it was known over in the UK, was just astonishing to see all these characters suddenly coming together in this massive, epic adventure. It was the stuff of dreams come true, if you like. And although by that stage I was significantly older than the target audience, I think it's a bit like Doctor Who and Star Wars and Star Trek and things like that. They have a cross-generational appeal because we remember watching them when we were younger, and they get new audiences, new younger generations latch onto these things, they discover them, and they find their own way around the the labyrinth of continuity and the labyrinth of worlds that these things create. And I think that's what happened with Marvel. These characters were well known amongst comic strip fans, and even though I was a massively lapsed comic strip fan by 2008, I was familiar with these characters and I liked these characters. I had a lot of time for them. It was exciting to see them all coming to the screen. But as the MCU went on, of course, it sort of happens with films, especially when you've got actors tied to contracts for 5 films or 6 films or whatever. When the contracts expire, the actors naturally enough want to move on. It's not like you pick up a new comic book every month to see a new Spider-Man adventure or a new Iron Man adventure. You have to wait 3 years for a new Iron Man film or a Spider-Man film by necessity. I mean, that's understandable. I'm not complaining about that. That's just the way of the filmmaking. You can't make this sort of film annually. It has to be on a 2 or 3 year basis if you're lucky. But I think that's the built-in obsolescence of the characters on screen, because Spider-Man, Iron Man, all these characters, they're timeless and they're ageless in comics. They don't have to age. They don't have to change. No matter how much they reflect the world they live in, they never really change physically or in terms of what the characters are. Now, I will admit that I'm not into modern comics. I think I've mentioned this in the past. You'll have seen in my pickup videos, if I have comic books that I pick up, it's always classic collections, because I just don't like modern comics. I think that comics went through that graphic novel phase, probably after the Dark Knight, Frank Miller's Dark Knight. They suddenly decided it was time to grow up. And I think that misses part of the appeal. I think part of the appeal of comics is that, a bit like the films and things, they're cross-generational. And I think to try and make them adult with adult themes and situations doesn't really work. I think you're forcing a mentality on something that isn't meant to have that mentality. It's supposed to have a certain childishness to them. And I'm not saying that they have to have the naivety of the early 60s comics, because over the last few years, I have picked up lots of collections of the early Stan Lees and Jack Kirby's and so on. And yes, the very naive storytelling is very old-fashioned, but that's part of their charm. I think there's a sort of a middle ground, perhaps, where you can do crazy imaginative adventures, but not try to be too adult in the way that you do them. And also, I'm not really keen on modern artwork. I think modern art just doesn't have that flair that you had in the 60s and 70s. But hey, that's just my opinion. I'm going off the track a little bit. So in terms of the films, we've had all these films, we've had all these phases of the MCU. And I think everybody agrees that Marvel, the cinematic universe, peaked with Avengers Endgame. That was like a huge, massive crossover. And it was a celebration of everything Marvel had done at the time. For a comparison, I think of the end of Russell T Davies's first era in Doctor Who, when you had, at the end of season 4, that 2-part finale, The Stolen Earth and Journey's End, which was the end, more or less the end of the David Tennant era, or heading towards the end of the David Tennant era. And Russell Davies, he was himself moving on to the series at the time, and that was a celebration of what he and the series had achieved by bringing back all the characters that he'd created and all the characters that appeared and all the crossovers. And that's very much reflective of what they did in Avengers Endgame. And much in the way that I don't think Doctor Who's been the same since. It's been entertaining at times, been frustrating at times, but I think you do feel that, I think after David Tennant, it was a bit downhill for Doctor Who. And it's still struggling because of that, really. And I think it's the same with Marvel. You had this huge peak with Endgame, and everything since then, some of it hugely entertaining, has felt like postscripts, has felt like not exactly unnecessary, but they've struggled to match the energy and excitement and the sheer pizzazz of Infinity War and Endgame, which were just two massive full stops on what Marvel had already achieved. And I think what's happened since then, obviously now you don't have your Iron Man, you don't have Captain America. Thor is no longer recognisable, frankly, as the Thor we've seen in earlier films. And Spider-Man sort of drifts in and out of the MCU in accordance with the whims of Sony's licensing. So what we've got now are new characters, not the big hitters anymore. I think Iron Man and Captain America and Thor were such huge revelations for the cinema audience. People who liked superhero films but hadn't really come across these characters, because let's face it, they were all fairly C or D grade characters, really big in the world of Marvel, but not big hitters like Superman, Batman, even Wonder Woman, perhaps. They're not those sort of really well-known characters. Spider-Man was probably MCU's best-known character. So all these characters have been built up into these 21st century cinematic icons, and they're not there anymore. So Marvel has to find its way forward without those characters, referencing those characters, perhaps a bit too much at times, but trying to establish new characters from the second tier, the second rank of characters. And I think that what we've had is films with characters that just aren't as interesting, and TV series that aren't as interesting. And it is a relief then when you go back to see characters that remind you of Marvel's great days. I mean, at the moment we've got Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3 in the cinemas. It's doing extremely well, and it's heading towards probably worldwide box office take of around not far short of $1 billion. And that's worked because those characters, they were fairly out there. They were introduced, I think 2014 was the first Guardians film. I remember going to see that at a press screening in London and thinking, wow, I knew of the character, I knew the title, I didn't know much about the characters, but I remember sort of vaguely having read some of the comics back in the 70s and thinking, this is a bit different for Marvel. This is, they're taking a risk with these unknown characters. But with James Gunn directing and writing and with the cast he assembled, it was a massive hit. And I think that now we've had the Guardians drifting in and out of the Avengers films, we're familiar with the character. So seeing the Guardians, this new film, is a reminder of the earlier days of Marvel, when Marvel could do no wrong, which is why it's done so well. And it is a very good film. It's made with a lot of care and attention. It's very well put together. And I do think, much as I enjoy Marvel films and they are an event, the last couple of years, certainly since the pandemic, there's almost as if they're trying too hard to make successes of characters that really are very obscure. I'm not going to go back through all the films and TV that we've had over the last couple of years. Oh, I might. I might well do. It's not that they'd be badly made. I think the film's very well made. I think there's been an issue with effects and some, there's been slightly iffy effects. And I think that's all tied up with deadlines and release dates and so on, and effects houses being swamped with work that they have to do for not just Marvel films, a lot of big action films these days, very CGI reliant. And there's only so many effects houses who do this stuff, and I think perhaps they have to occasionally turn in stuff that's a bit substandard, maybe. It doesn't really stand up to the quality you've had in previous films. And I think that's the same in terms of the films themselves. They're just not quite as good. Now, whether that's because we're used to Marvel titles, we're used to such a high quality throughout the first three phases that all of a sudden we can't help but notice that things aren't as good as they were. And I think that has led to this groundswell of opinion that MCU's lost its magic. And I think whether you think it has or not depends on what you think of the films they've come up with recently and the characters that they've introduced across various TV and film platforms. I'll talk about the Disney Plus series first of all. I think Disney Plus has been a bit of a backhanded thing for Marvel because it's forced them to generate more content, and because it's on TV, necessarily it can't quite match the scale and spectacle of the films. It's not an event anymore, and because there's been so much Marvel TV interspersed with a lot of films, it's made Marvel feel that special. It's made Marvel stuff feel that less of an event, and that's sort of inevitable, I suppose. I think Marvel has been accused of, and I would agree, it's just that perhaps, or Disney, probably Disney more than Marvel itself, Disney are trying to sort of milk the cash cow. And I think the cash cow is running dry a little bit, or has been running dry. If you look at the TV series, I think we started off brilliantly with WandaVision. I think that was a really clever, imaginative series. I had a lot of time for The Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I know there were some production issues in that, and I think that sort of shows in some of the scripting. But I think that was good. A series I enjoyed because, again, they were characters that we're familiar with from the film series, so it was nice to revisit those characters. Loki was, that's where I think this is where Marvel's problems lie now, really, is with the whole multiverse saga that they're pinning a lot of their hopes on. I think the multiverse saga the whole idea of the multiverse is so huge and so vast and so remote and cold, it's hard to care. The multiverse suggesting that there are an ultimate number of or infinite number of characters across different universes. You sort of think it's such a huge thing. It's such a huge science fiction concept that it's hard to ground it in the way that the early Marvel films were grounded. So you could go in to see Iron Man and Captain America and see these stories about very relatable characters with extraordinary powers and extraordinary abilities in a very real world where the stakes were high and death was a constant threat. Where you've got a multiverse, you sort of think, well, you know, it's no real threat. I mean, this could be the way they could bring back Iron Man and Captain America. Just pluck an Iron Man from a multiverse and chuck him back on screen. And there's a sensation that the death doesn't mean anything really, because characters will come back one way or another. So I think the multiverse is a science fiction idea too far for Marvel. I think it's just not appealing to a general audience who have enjoyed straightforward action films that we've had in the past. Clever, spectacular, sophisticated action films, but action films. When you start drifting into concepts about the time variance, agency, and ultimate different versions of character, infinite different versions of characters, it's not as engaging. I don't find it as engaging, and I don't imagine that the general public do either. And I think that's where the wheels came off Loki. It started off quite interesting, sort of lost. I struggled through to the end of it, but by the end of it, I wasn't really invested. I wasn't particularly interested. Of course, there's a lot of identity politics and gender politics to play into these things now, where you realise that stories are influenced by the modern obsession with these issues. And I think there are ways of presenting these issues on screen, and I think when it's done in a way that's shoehorned in, it derails the narrative a bit when your writers and directors and actors and so on are thinking about, we've got to address these issues that are contemporary. I don't really want to do that. I'm aware of the contemporary world. It's shoved on my throat every day. I watch these films because I want to watch crazy, wild, imaginative things happen. I want to be taken away from the real world. I don't want all the issues that we see flung up hysterically in front of us every day on my entertainment, by and large. And I know that there are platforms where these issues are highlighted, and it's just question of balance, I suppose, really. In terms of the other TV series we've had, there was What If, the animated series, there were some interesting episodes there, but it was inessential. Hawkeye, I thought, was a terrific series. I did love Hawkeye because that was very, very closely linked to the MCU itself. I liked the character of Hawkeye. I liked Jeremy Renner, and it felt like an adjunct to the Avengers films. And it was some great action sequences. It was just massively enjoyable, I think. I can't think of them in order. Moon Knight again. Moon Knight was a character, talk about obscure. Moon Knight is a character who's from the more esoteric end of the Marvel range, if you like. And I found the series started off quite well, but eventually went down avenues that just didn't interest me anymore. And I sort of lost interest in that. I finished it, but I wasn't necessarily bothered about seeing anymore, which is a shame because I quite liked the concept of Moon Knight, and it was quite nice to have another costumed crime-fighting character, but he wasn't that, and we didn't really see very much of Moon Knight. We had She-Hulk, which was a disaster as far as I'm concerned. I mean, one of the problems, again, that was often levelled at, or the accusations that's levelled at Marvel, is this emphasis on humour, that they've got to have this snarky wit, and I think they have done that a little bit too much. I mean, if you think about the character of Thor has become this comedic buffoon, and I know that Marvel's comedy is quite specific. When it's done well, it's very good, and it's very engaging, very amusing. But when you try to make a complete comedy out of something, I mean, I think She-Hulk was supposed to be a comedy series, but the first episode was okay. The episode with Daredevil wasn't too bad, even though it was clearly a more comedic take on Daredevil than we've seen in the past. I don't like his new costume. But I think Marvel's reliance on this constant sort of snappy, snarky humour detracts from the drama. It was an issue I had with Doctor Who under Stephen Moffat. I've always said Doctor Who should be witty, should be funny. They shouldn't be trying to find jokes all the time. I know Stephen Moffat was a comedy writer. He brought that sensibility to Doctor Who. I think Doctor Who should say witty things. Doctor Who should have a certain wit to it. But if you try to make it funny all the time, where's the drama? And I think this is a problem that Marvel have had since they discovered that people liked the comedies, the wit of it, and they turned it into comedy. In terms of other series we had Miss Marvel. I sort of enjoyed that. That was very watchable, but it's about a teenage Muslim girl becoming a superhero. Couldn't be less aimed at me if it tried. And I do feel that sometimes that these things are aimed at a demographic that I shouldn't really be part of. So I sort of enjoyed it. It was clearly, I've said this before, I don't watch something to identify with it. I watch something to enjoy it and to be entertained by it. And I'm conscious that stuff is aimed at certain people. Miss Marvel is certainly aimed at a young audience and a diverse audience. It is not meant for me. Doesn't mean I can't enjoy it, but it's not meant for me. And I think that sometimes they lean a bit too heavily into the audience that is aimed for rather than a more general audience. There's no reason I can't watch Miss Marvel, and I did watch Miss Marvel, but I don't get as much out of it as the younger audience that it was clearly aimed for. So the Marvel TV stuff has been sort of hit and miss. Film-wise, Phase 4 was very rocky, there's no denying it, but I've enjoyed it, and as a sort of a Marvel apologist, I would always say, well, I think Marvel has still got it, but I think they have to tread carefully now. I think in the last phase, I sort of enjoyed half of Shang-Chi, the sort of grittier modern half. I think when they went off into this fantasy kingdom, much as it was entertaining, it sort of lost me a little bit. I wasn't quite as entertained by it. I did like Shang-Chi and the Multiverse of Madness. That doesn't really get a good press. But again, it was the sort of a core Marvel character from earlier phases, and that sort of connects you back to the earlier phases. I think Benedict Cumberbatch is great as Doctor Strange. I thought that was a really good film directed by Sam Raimi, who went as far as he could to make it a Sam Raimi film without frightening horses. More recently, of course, we had Spider-Man No Way Home, which was a massive triumph, a huge hit film. But it's Spider-Man. You're always going to do well with Spider-Man. Of course, we had 3 Spider-Men, lots of all villains. It was just it was a great big piece of massive fan fiction, massively entertaining. More recently, though, we had Thor, Love and Thunder, which was Taika Waititi's second comedy Thor film, which I didn't find as irritating as Ragnarok, but it did become tiresome, and I think that we've taken that comedy Thor as far as we can. More recently, I'm trying to think, we had, The Eternals was boring and unnecessary. I think it was this is what I mean by Marvel bringing us these really obscure characters. I mean, the Eternals have never been successful in comics, really. They've had a couple of comics runs, but they've never flown. They've always sort of had a limited appeal and a limited series. Why they thought they could make it work as a film, I don't know, because they certainly dumped the stuff in Jack Kirby's original version that was interesting and just turned them into this slightly generic bunch of superpowered, rather bland characters who had a backstory that didn't really sit well with everything else we know from Marvel, and doesn't seem to be leading anywhere because the film didn't do very well, wasn't very well received, despite being directed by Chloe Zhao, the Oscar winner. What have we had since then? We had Black Panther Wakanda Forever, which was fine, but again, it suffered from the loss of Chadwick Boseman. I want to see Black Panther, because I like the character of Black Panther. There's a lot of potential there, but of course, not Marvel's fault, of course. Chadwick Boseman sadly passed away, and I don't know that persevering with the Black Panther universe as a major franchise works without its leading man. And then we've had Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania, which I enjoyed because I like Paul Rudd, I like Ant-Man, but it did miss the lightness that the first two had. And I said about Marvel comedy films, I think that the humor of the Ant-Man films work very well because Paul Rudd is essentially a comic actor. I think there's a lot you could do with... I've always liked these things about small people and giant people and stuff like that. I like that sort of thing. And I think Quantumania, being set in an entirely miniature realm, you didn't really have that effect of giants in a real world and a small person running around in a real world. And I think that's the appeal of the Ant-Man films. And of course we've got Guardians 3, which is doing brilliantly because it's a call back to great characters. So, very rambling. I think the MCU's peaked. I think it's had its glory days. I don't see how it can have that back now, because it's like all these things. It's been around for 15 years now. It's not new anymore. It's not the new thing. You do get a lot of people go, another Marvel film. And that's inevitable. Doesn't mean they can't be good. Doesn't mean they can't be entertaining, but they don't have the shock of the new anymore. And that's, I think, what happened with Doctor Who. When Doctor Who arrived back again in 2005, for 3 or 4 years, it was like Doctor Who is incredible. It's amazing. It's because it was new. I mean, it had been around before, of course, but it had new audiences, and it was opening up this Pandora's box of the Doctor's universe and these characters and the mythology. But that became a little bit tired after a while, and people drifted away because it wasn't new, and people move on to new things, which is why I'm sort of hoping that Russell T Davies has a few special treats in his box of tricks that will bring that back to Doctor Who again. So I think this is what we have with Marvel, and it's now 30 odd films in, umpteen TV series, and because there's been so much of it, people are blasé about it. People, not that they're not interested in it, but it's got to be really good now to capture people's attention. And I think that's the problem Marvel will have going forward. They've got to be really good. They've got to be better than they've been, because I think they've been coasting along, making quite serviceable films, but they're not groundbreaking. They're not top tier anymore. They're sort of mid tier. And I think they need to find a way, if they want to keep their head above water, they need to find some way to capture the general audience again, to really make them event films. I mean, they are event films, but a lot of people choosing not to partake in that event anymore because the box office has been dropping. You know, the films are doing well. They're not flopping. They're not losing money, but they're not the massive, phenomenal successes that they were back in the early days. But that's to be expected because it's not the early days anymore. We're 15 years in now, and the audience is probably looking for new things. And again, it's the general question of superhero fatigue. DC have been struggling, whether James Gunn can breathe new life into that, or whether it's just time to give the genre a rest, or to dial the genre back a bit, because we've had a lot of superhero films, and this year, couple of years, we've seen things tank very badly. I mean, Black Adam did very badly, wasn't a good film, deserved to tank. Frustratingly, Shazam! Fury of the Gods did even worse. I don't think it took 150 million at the worldwide box office. It was a really good film. So I think that people are being choosier. Again, you have to take into account the cost of living crisis. People going to the cinema, they want to be guaranteed a good time. And if they're not sure about something, or they didn't enjoy the previous film in this world or universe, they're going to say, well, I'll wait till this arrives on streaming. So there's so many things to take into account. The whole issue of streaming, people waiting until something appears on a streaming service. If you're paying 10 quid or $10 or whatever for a streaming service, you don't necessarily want to go to the cinema and pay triple that to see a film that's going to turn up on streaming in a few months' time. You'll sit and wait and watch it at home. So there's so much to take into account. But the general issue, as far as I'm concerned, is I think, Marvel has peaked. They're coasting along now with characters that maybe aren't as interesting as the ones who established the whole universe back in the first place. But that's an inevitable thing, I think. When you've been around that long, you lose a certain momentum, and you start to sort of dig deeper into the topsoil and find those less well-regarded characters. So anyway, that's my take on it. My bottom line take is that I'm still a sort of day one Marvel film viewer, but I come out of the films less punch the air as I once was, probably. I enjoy the films, but I'm conscious of the fact that the artistry isn't quite the same as it was. It does feel a bit like a conveyor belt. I think it's heartening that Marvel, I think, are conscious of that, and they're dialing down or dialing back on their productions. There's less TV stuff in the pipeline, and I think the films I think they're trying to restrict themselves to 3 films. With Guardians is out now, the next one is out in November. That's the Marvels, which doesn't look great from the trailer, to be honest. And that's not, again, it's not one that I'm desperately looking forward to. So I hope Marvel can find a way to to find a middle ground where they can do well. But I think that, the glory days, I mean, it was great to enjoy the glory days. I'm so glad I've lived through that period where Marvel was the thing, because it was a big thing for me in the 70s. And then I drifted away in the late 70s. But always remember those characters and remember those comics and how much I enjoyed reading those stories. And it was nice to see that Marvel were able to bring them to the screen. The problem with them now is keeping that going without having the big hitters and trying to make these minor characters big hitters. I mean, I'm trying to wrap this video up, but I keep thinking of other things. Shang-Chi came out 2 years ago. as far as I know, there's nothing else planned for Shang-Chi. It was set up at the end of the film that he was going to get involved in all this crazy stuff. We've not seen him since. And as far as I know, they're not making anything new with Shang-Chi at the moment. So even if they're going to make a sequel, it's going to be a year before they start making it. It's going to be 2 years before it comes out. So it's going to be 5-6 years since the last Shang-Chi film. So part of me wishes that they would focus on a handful of characters and do good stuff with them. It's such a huge thing. I could talk for hours about this. There's so many different options and opinions and things that, are coming, things that we've had, things that, where we're going to go, I don't really know. So anyway, that's my take on Marvel. I know it's been a bit rambly. If you enjoyed this video, and if you're a Marvel fan, why not let me know what you think about the current state of the MCU and where you think it may be going? Do you think it's finished? Do you think they should stop, put up stumps and say, right, we've done this, we're going to stop and concentrate to do something else? Or do you think there's life in Marvel? And I think there is, but it's just a question of how they structure what they're going to do. Kevin Feige's got a interesting job in trying to keep Marvel of interest in the face of other fads and phenomenons that come along, if you like. Anyway, let me know what you think, what your views are on Marvel, and leave a comment down below. Like and subscribe as well. There's a subscribe button there that you can press, and you'll be notified, and you can see all these videos that I do as when I do them. Right, hope you've enjoyed this. It's been a bit rambly, as I said. It's just something I decided to do this morning. I thought, well, I haven't done a video for a while, and there's nothing particular I want to review at the moment, although I have got a couple of retro choices that have been sent to me, which I'll be coming to soon. So I thought I would just do this today, as it's a sort of a hot topic at the moment. Right, I'm going to go now. Thank you for watching. This has been a bit longer than I anticipated, but yeah, leave me a comment, like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Until I know, keep taking the stuff. Oh, I didn't wink. Bye.